On a cloudy late afternoon, a veterinary transport truck slowly moves down a deserted cobblestone street. Inside, a black horse, still bearing the mark of the cavalry, stares fixedly at the metal stall. Without announcing his arrival, the driver gets out and hands the euthanasia papers to the counter. On the other side of the gate, an old woman with firm steps approaches and shouts loudly, without hesitation, "Let him go!" The sound echoes among the sheds, briefly interrupting the employee's routine. For a few seconds, no one moves a muscle. And there, in the center of the yard, the horse neighs like never before. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now back to our story. The morning mist hung low over Richmond's cobblestone streets as Thunder, the magnificent black stallion of the Richmond Police Department's mounted unit, made what would unknowingly be his final patrol through the historic downtown district. For 7 years, this noble animal had been the pride of the force, his glossy coat reflecting the early sunlight as he carried Officer Michael Stevens with unwavering precision through the bustling city center. Thunder's reputation preceded him wherever he went. Tourists would stop mid-conversation to photograph the imposing figure, while longtime residents of Richmond's Fan District would wave from their Victorian porches, knowing they could set their clocks by his disciplined morning rounds. His temperament was legendary among the mounted unit officers, calm under pressure, responsive to the slightest command, and possessing an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings that made him invaluable during crowd control situations. But something had changed in the sterile halls of the Richmond Police Department headquarters that Tuesday morning. Captain William Morrison sat behind his mahogany desk, his weathered face bearing the stern expression that had become his trademark. Over 2 decades of service, the incident report lay before him, its official letterhead stark against the dark wood surface. The document would seal Thunder's fate with clinical efficiency, reducing years of faithful service to a series of bureaucratic checkboxes and standardized phrases. The incident in question had occurred during what was supposed to be a routine presence operation at a peaceful demonstration in Monroe Park. The event, organized by local community groups advocating for improved public transportation, had drawn nearly 300 participants on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Politicians, including Congressman Robert Hayes, were scheduled to make appearances, and the mounted unit had been deployed to provide both security and an impressive visual presence that would photograph well for the evening news. According to the official report that Morrison was now reviewing, Thunder had broken formation during a critical moment, disrupting the carefully choreographed display that was meant to showcase the department's professionalism. The deviation had occurred at precisely 2:47 p.m., just as Congressman Hayes was approaching the podium for his scheduled address. Officer Stevens had signaled for Thunder to maintain position alongside the other horses in the unit, but instead, the stallion had suddenly veered left, pushing through the crowd with what the report described as unpredictable and potentially dangerous behavior. Morrison's pen hovered over the signature line as he recalled the conversation he'd had with Stevens immediately following the incident. The young officer had seemed confused, almost defensive, as he tried to explain Thunder's actions. He insisted that the horse had remained calm throughout the maneuver, that there had been no aggression in his movement, and that the crowd had parted naturally without any signs of panic or distress. But Morrison couldn't afford to have such details complicate the narrative that was already taking shape in his mind. The truth was that Morrison had been facing increasing pressure from city officials about the mounted unit's budget and effectiveness. Questions had been raised about the practical necessity of maintaining horses in an urban police force, especially given the rising costs of care, training, and housing for the animals. A single incident involving an unpredictable horse could provide the justification needed to make some difficult decisions about the program's future, decisions that would ultimately benefit Morrison's standing with the fiscal hawks in City Hall. Thunder's file, thick with commendation letters and positive performance reviews, sat unopened in Morrison's desk drawer. The stallion had never shown aggressive behavior toward humans or other animals. His training records indicated consistent excellence in all required skills, from crowd navigation to riot control exercises. Multiple officers had requested to be partnered with Thunder over the years, and his presence had been specifically requested for high-profile events due to his reliable temperament. None of this mattered now. Morrison signed his name with decisive strokes, officially classifying Thunder as unsuitable for continued service. The recommendation was clear and final: immediate removal from active duty and transport to the veterinary facility that handled such matters for the department. The process would be conducted with the same quiet efficiency that characterized all internal administrative actions, without fanfare or public discussion. Dr. Patricia Hendricks at the Richmond Animal Control Facility received the official paperwork by courier that same afternoon. She'd handled similar cases before, though something about this particular order struck her as unusual. The horse in question had no history of injury or illness that would warrant such drastic action. His psychological evaluation from just 6 months earlier had rated him as exceptionally stable and well-suited for continued service. As Thunder was loaded into the transport trailer behind police headquarters, his usual composure remained intact. He stepped calmly up the ramp, his hooves echoing hollowly against the metal flooring. Officer Stevens watched from a distance, his face etched with concern and confusion. He'd requested a meeting with Morrison to discuss alternative solutions, perhaps additional training or reassignment to less demanding duties, but his requests had been dismissed without consideration. The trailer pulled away from the loading dock at exactly 4:30 p.m., disappearing into the late afternoon traffic of downtown Richmond. Thunder's stall in the police stables would be cleaned and prepared for his replacement by Morning, a younger mare from the training facility in Lexington, who had shown promise during her recent evaluation. The department's press release would be brief and professional, mentioning only that personnel changes were part of routine operations aimed at maintaining the highest standards of public safety. What Captain Morrison hadn't anticipated was that Thunder's transport would take him past the very neighborhood where he'd spent his earliest years before his recruitment into police service. The rural outskirts of Hanover County, with its rolling pastures and weathered fence posts, held memories that neither bureaucracy nor official paperwork could erase. And somewhere in those memories was a connection that would soon emerge to challenge everything Morrison thought he had carefully orchestrated. As the transport vehicle turned onto Route 301, heading north toward the facility that would determine Thunder's final fate, an elderly woman named Eleanor Patterson was tending to her garden behind a modest white farmhouse, unaware that her life was about to intersect with a story of injustice that would test the very foundations of her belief in doing what was right, regardless of the consequences. Eleanor Patterson had always been an early riser, but this particular Wednesday morning found her standing by her kitchen window at dawn, a steaming cup of coffee in her weathered hands as she watched the mist roll across her small property in Hanover County. At 73, she maintained the same routine she'd followed for decades: morning chores, afternoon garden work, and evening conversations with her grandson Marcus during his weekly calls from the city. The phone rang just as she was settling into her favorite armchair with the Richmond Times-Dispatch, its shrill tone cutting through the peaceful silence of her farmhouse. Marcus's voice carried an unusual tension that immediately put her on alert. As a journalism student at Virginia Commonwealth University and an intern at WRIC-TV, her grandson had developed an instinct for stories that mattered, and Eleanor had learned to trust his judgment about what deserved attention. "Grandma Ellie, I need you to sit down for this," Marcus began, his words tumbling out in the rapid-fire manner that indicated he'd been thinking about this conversation all night. "I was at the station yesterday, helping with research on a community interest piece, when I overheard something that's been eating at me. There's a story about a police horse that's being put down today, and something about it just doesn't add up." Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone receiver. She'd always had a special connection with horses, dating back to her childhood on her family's larger farm in Caroline County. Even now, decades after circumstances had forced her to sell most of her land, she maintained a small stable and provided sanctuary for retired horses from various organizations throughout central Virginia. Marcus continued with the details he'd managed to piece together through his contacts at the police department and City Hall. A black stallion named Thunder, 7 years of service with the mounted unit, exemplary record until a single incident at Monroe Park. The official story involved unpredictable behavior during a public event, but Marcus had spoken with several witnesses who described something entirely different from what appeared in the police reports. "The people I talked to said this horse saved a child, Grandma. A little girl had gotten separated from her parents during the demonstration and wandered into a dangerous spot where the crowd was thickest. They say Thunder left formation to protect her, kept her safe until adults could reach her. But that's not what's in the official report." Eleanor felt her heart rate quicken as Marcus described the horse in more detail. Black stallion, distinctive white markings on his left front hoof, a calm demeanor that had made him legendary among Richmond's mounted police unit. The description triggered memories she'd kept buried for years, memories of a young colt she'd raised on this very property before financial hardship had forced her to make the most difficult decision of her life. 7 years ago, Eleanor had been facing foreclosure on her farm after her husband Robert's medical bills had drained their savings. The bank had given her 60 days to raise $30,000 or lose everything Robert's family had built over 3 generations. In desperation, she'd contacted horse traders throughout Virginia, hoping to find buyers for her small herd of quarter horses and thoroughbreds. One particular colt had been the hardest to part with, a black foal with unusual intelligence and sensitivity that she'd hand-raised after his mother had complications during birth. She'd named him Midnight Storm, though she'd always called him Storm for short. The trader who'd purchased him had mentioned connections with law enforcement agencies that were always looking for suitable animals for their mounted units. As Marcus continued describing Thunder's physical characteristics and temperament, Eleanor felt a growing certainty that defied logical explanation. The white markings, the exceptional intelligence, the protective instincts toward children, every detail matched her memories of the colt she'd raised with her own hands. "Marcus, I need you to find out exactly where they're taking this horse," she said, her voice carrying a determination that surprised even her. "And I need you to help me get there as quickly as possible." Her grandson's confusion was evident in his voice. "Grandma, what aren't you telling me? Why are you so interested in this particular case?" Eleanor closed her eyes and made a decision that would change both their lives. "Because I think that horse used to be mine. I think Thunder is Storm, the colt I raised and sold 7 years ago. And if I'm right, then we're not just talking about an injustice to an animal, we're talking about the destruction of one of the most remarkable creatures I've ever known." The urgency in Eleanor's voice galvanized Marcus into action. Within an hour, he'd used his journalism contacts to determine that Thunder had been transported to the Regional Animal Services facility on the outskirts of Richmond, where a 48-hour observation period was standard protocol, before final procedures were implemented. Eleanor had that narrow window to prove her claims and potentially save a life that had once depended entirely on her care and protection. Eleanor's hands shook as she retrieved a small metal box from her bedroom closet, a container she hadn't opened since the day she'd said goodbye to Storm years earlier. Inside were his registration papers, veterinary records, and photographs that documented his growth from a gangly foal to a magnificent young stallion. Most importantly, there were detailed notes about his unique behavioral traits and the training, techniques she'd used to develop his exceptional responsiveness to human emotional cues. One photograph in particular captured something that no official police document could replicate: Storm's distinctive way of tilting his head when he was concentrating, a gesture that had always made Eleanor smile because it reminded her of a child trying to understand a complex adult conversation. If Thunder truly was her Storm, this mannerism would have remained unchanged despite years of police training and protocol. Marcus arrived at his grandmother's farmhouse within 2 hours of their phone conversation, his compact car loaded with camera equipment and recording devices from the television station. He'd also brought copies of the official incident reports he'd managed to obtain through his media credentials, documents that Eleanor read with growing anger and disbelief. The discrepancies between the official version and witness accounts were stark and troubling. Captain Morrison's report described Thunder as exhibiting signs of behavioral instability and creating a public safety risk through unpredictable actions. But the witness statements Marcus had collected painted a completely different picture of a horse whose protective instincts had prevented a potential tragedy. Mrs. Jennifer Walsh, a local teacher who'd been at the demonstration with her own children, had provided the most detailed account of what actually happened. According to her statement, a 4-year-old girl named Sarah Chen had slipped away from her parents during the excitement of the political speeches. The child had wandered toward the area where the crowd was densest, directly in the path of people who were moving toward the speaker's platform and couldn't see her small form among the adults. Thunder had apparently noticed the child's predicament before any human observer and had gently maneuvered through the crowd to create a protective barrier around her. His movement had been deliberate and careful, guiding people away from the little girl without causing panic or alarm. When Sarah's frantic parents finally spotted their daughter, they found her standing calmly beside the great black horse, her small hand resting trustingly against his neck. The revelation that Thunder's disobedience had actually been an act of heroism filled Eleanor with a fierce, protective anger she hadn't felt since her late husband's battles with insurance companies over his medical treatment. This was her Storm, she was now certain, and he was facing punishment for demonstrating exactly the kind of compassionate intelligence she'd nurtured in him from birth. The injustice of the situation demanded action, and Eleanor Patterson had never been one to back down from a fight when she knew she was right. The Richmond Regional Animal Services facility stood like a fortress of bureaucracy behind its chain link, fencing and sterile concrete walls, its utilitarian architecture offering no comfort to those who arrived with desperate hopes and fraying nerves. Eleanor Patterson sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's Honda Civic, clutching her metal box of documents, while her grandson navigated the parking lot with the focused intensity of someone who understood that timing could mean the difference between success and heartbreak. "Remember, Grandma, let me do the talking initially," Marcus said as he pulled into a space near the main entrance. "I've got press credentials, and that might get us through the door faster than emotional appeals. Once we're inside and can assess the situation, we'll figure out our next move." Eleanor nodded, though every fiber of her being wanted to charge through those doors immediately and demand to see the horse that might be her beloved Storm. 7 years of wondering about his fate, 7 years of hoping he'd found happiness and purpose in his new life, had culminated in this moment of reckoning. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as they approached the reception desk, where a young woman with tired eyes looked up from her computer screen with the practiced neutrality of someone who dealt with difficult situations every day. Marcus introduced himself as a reporter from WRIC-TV, explaining that he was researching a story about police animal welfare protocols and specifically requesting information about a horse that had been transferred from the Richmond Police Department. The receptionist, whose name tag identified her as Jessica, seemed relieved to be dealing with media rather than another distraught pet owner, and she directed them to speak with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the facility's director. Dr. Hendricks emerged from her office 15 minutes later, a tall woman in her 50s whose white coat bore the subtle stains that indicated hands-on work with animals rather than purely administrative duties. Her expression was professional, but guarded as she shook hands with Marcus and acknowledged Eleanor with a polite nod that suggested she was accustomed to family members appearing unexpectedly in situations like this. "I understand you're interested in the police horse that was brought in yesterday," Dr. Hendricks said, gesturing toward a small conference room adjacent to the main lobby. "I can provide general information about our procedures, but specific details about individual animals require proper authorization from the transferring agency." Marcus activated the recording app on his phone and began with standard questions about the facility's protocols and standards of care, establishing a professional tone that seemed to put Dr. Hendricks at ease. Eleanor listened with growing impatience as they discussed operational procedures and regulatory oversight, knowing that somewhere in this building, a horse who might be her Storm was awaiting a fate that could still be prevented if she could just prove their connection. "Dr. Hendricks," Eleanor finally interrupted, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "I believe the horse you're holding was once mine. I have documentation that might prove his identity, and I'm requesting permission to see him before any final decisions are made." The veterinarian's professional demeanor shifted slightly, revealing a flicker of curiosity and something that might have been sympathy. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern, but you have to understand that we receive many claims from people who believe they recognize animals in our care. The emotional stress of these situations can sometimes cause people to see connections that aren't actually there." Eleanor opened her metal box and withdrew the photographs of Storm as a young horse, spreading them across the conference table with the reverent care of someone handling precious artifacts. Dr. Hendricks leaned forward to examine the images, her trained eye taking in the distinctive markings and physical characteristics that Eleanor had documented so carefully years earlier. "The white marking on the left front hoof," Eleanor said, pointing to a close-up photograph that showed Storm's distinctive feature with perfect clarity. "It's shaped like a crescent moon, and there's a small scar just above it from when he caught his leg on a fence wire as a yearling. I treated that wound myself, and I documented the healing process because I thought it might affect his future and soundness." Dr. Hendricks studied the photograph intently, then looked up at Eleanor with a new level of attention. "That's quite specific, Mrs. Patterson, and you're saying this horse was sold to law enforcement approximately 7 years ago?" "To a trader named Bill Hudson, who said he had connections with police departments throughout Virginia," Eleanor confirmed. "I kept copies of all the sales documents, including health records and training notes. Storm was exceptional even as a young horse, unusually intelligent, remarkably gentle with children, and possessing what I can only describe as an emotional sensitivity that went far beyond normal equine behavior." Marcus sensed the shift in Dr. Hendricks' attitude and pressed their advantage. "Would it be possible for my grandmother to see the horse just to confirm whether her suspicions are correct?" If she's mistaken, we'll leave immediately and won't take up any more of your time. But if she's right, then we're looking at a completely different situation." Dr. Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, weighing professional protocols against the compelling evidence spread before her on the table. Finally, she stood and walked to the window that overlooked the facility's holding area, where several large enclosures housed animals awaiting various outcomes. "The horse in question is scheduled for evaluation tomorrow morning," she said without turning around. "Standard protocol requires a 48-hour observation period during which we assess behavior, health status, and any factors that might influence our final recommendation. I suppose it wouldn't violate any regulations to allow you to observe him from a distance, as long as you understand that physical contact isn't permitted without proper authorization." Eleanor felt a surge of hope mixed with nervous anticipation as they followed Dr. Hendricks through a series of corridors that led to the facility's stable area. The smell of hay and disinfectant filled the air, punctuated by the occasional sound of horses moving in their stalls. As they approached the observation area, Eleanor found herself holding her breath, preparing for a moment that would either confirm her deepest fears or validate her most desperate hopes. The black stallion stood in a large stall, with his back toward the viewing window, his magnificent frame silhouetted against the afternoon light streaming through skylights above. Even from behind, Eleanor could see the proud bearing and muscular conformation that marked him as an exceptional animal. But it wasn't until he turned toward their voices that she knew with absolute certainty that her journey had led her to the right place. "Storm," she whispered, the name escaping her lips involuntarily as the horse's familiar profile came into view. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Thunder's head snapped up, his ears pricked forward with sharp attention as he searched for the source of the voice that had spoken his birth name for the first time in 7 years. When his eyes found Eleanor's face through the viewing window, he whinnied with a sound that conveyed recognition, longing, and something approaching joy. Dr. Hendricks stepped back in surprise as the horse began moving restlessly in his stall, his attention completely focused on the elderly woman whose presence had suddenly transformed his demeanor from resigned acceptance to animated alertness. "That's quite a reaction," she admitted, her professional skepticism clearly shaken by what she was witnessing. "I've been working with horses for 25 years, and I've rarely seen such an immediate and specific response to a person." Eleanor pressed her hand against the viewing window, tears streaming down her face as Thunder approached the barrier that separated them. The great horse stretched his neck toward her, and she could see in his dark eyes the same intelligence and gentle nature that had made their bond so special years earlier. Even more importantly, she noticed that he held his head at that distinctive angle she remembered so well, the gesture that had always indicated he was trying to understand something important. "It's him," she said with absolute conviction. "This is Storm, and everything I've heard about his supposed misconduct is completely wrong. This horse doesn't have a violent or unpredictable bone in his body. If he broke formation during that demonstration, it was because he saw something that required his intervention. That's exactly the kind of behavior I trained into him from the beginning, to think independently when human welfare was at stake." Marcus had been filming the reunion with his phone, capturing footage that would soon become crucial evidence in their fight to save Thunder's life. The emotional connection between his grandmother and the horse was undeniable. But he also understood that emotions alone wouldn't be sufficient to challenge official police reports and bureaucratic decisions. They needed allies, public support, and a strategy that could expose the truth about what had really happened at Monroe Park. As they prepared to leave the facility, Dr. Hendricks pulled Eleanor aside with a discretion that suggested she was bending regulations in ways that could complicate her professional position. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that the horse's behavior during his time here has been exemplary. He's calm, responsive, and shows no signs of the instability mentioned in the police reports. I'm required to follow official protocols, but I also have some discretion in scheduling procedures. If you're serious about challenging this decision, you should know that you have approximately 36 hours to present compelling evidence to the appropriate authorities. Eleanor squeezed the veterinarian's hand gratefully, recognizing the risk that Dr. Hendricks was taking by providing this information. As they walked back to Marcus's car, Eleanor's mind was already racing with plans and possibilities. Storm had recognized her, confirming beyond doubt that she was right about his identity. Now she needed to prove that his supposed misconduct had actually been an act of heroism, and she needed to do it quickly enough to save his life and expose the corruption that had brought him to this point. Marcus Patterson had inherited his grandmother's stubborn determination, but he'd also developed the investigative instincts that separated exceptional journalism students from those who simply went through the motions of their coursework. By Thursday morning, less than 18 hours after their visit to the animal facility, he'd transformed Eleanor's farmhouse kitchen into a makeshift newsroom, complete with laptops, interview equipment, and a growing collection of documents that told a very different story from the official police reports. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus had posted a carefully worded message on social media, describing Thunder's situation without revealing all the details of Eleanor's connection to the horse. Within hours, his phone was buzzing with responses from people who had been at Monroe Park during the demonstration and were eager to share what they had witnessed firsthand. Sarah Chen's parents, David and Linda, were among the first to respond. As the mother of the little girl who had been protected by Thunder, Linda Chen had been horrified to learn that the horse was facing punishment for what she considered an act of heroism. She invited Marcus and Eleanor to their suburban Richmond home, where they could provide a complete account of what had actually happened that Saturday afternoon. Sarah still talks about the big black horse, Linda said as she served coffee in her living room while her daughter played quietly nearby. She calls him her guardian angel horse. She doesn't understand why adults are upset about what happened, because from her perspective, Thunder appeared exactly when she needed him most. David Chen, an accountant with a methodical approach to documentation, had taken photographs throughout the demonstration, including several images that captured Thunder's careful navigation through the crowd. The photos showed none of the aggressive or unpredictable behavior described in Captain Morrison's report. Instead, they revealed a horse moving with deliberate precision, his body language calm and protective as he created space around the lost child. Look at his ears in these pictures, Eleanor said, studying the images with the expertise of someone who had spent a lifetime reading equine body language. They're forward and alert, but not pinned back in anger or fear. His neck position shows he was focused on something specific, and his movement through the crowd was controlled and purposeful. This isn't the behavior of an unstable animal. This is exactly what I trained him to do when he sensed that someone needed protection. Marcus interviewed the Chens extensively, recording their detailed account of Thunder's intervention. According to their testimony, Sarah had wandered away during the excitement of Congressman Hayes's arrival, slipping between adults who were focused on the political speeches and completely unaware of the small child moving among their legs. The crowd was thickest near the speaker's platform, where the press corps and VIP guests were positioned, creating exactly the kind of dangerous situation that Thunder had apparently recognized instinctively. The horse didn't charge through the crowd or cause any panic, David emphasized. He moved like he had a specific destination in mind, very calmly but with clear purpose. People stepped aside naturally because his presence was so commanding, but there was nothing threatening about his approach. When he reached Sarah, he positioned himself so that she was protected from the crowd movement, and he stayed that way until Linda and I could get to her. Armed with this testimony and photographic evidence, Marcus began reaching out to other witnesses who had been at the demonstration. Each interview added more details that contradicted the official version of events, painting a picture of a horse whose actions had been not only appropriate, but potentially life-saving. Mrs. Jennifer Walsh, the teacher who had provided the initial witness statement, was able to put Marcus in touch with several parents who had attended the event with their children. One of these parents, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, was a veterinarian who specialized in equine behavior. His professional assessment of Thunder's actions carried particular weight, and he volunteered to provide expert testimony about what the horse's body language and movement patterns indicated about his mental state during the incident. "What you're describing sounds like a classic example of protective herding behavior," Dr. Rodriguez explained during his phone interview with Marcus. "Some horses, particularly those with strong social intelligence, will instinctively move to shield vulnerable individuals from perceived threats. It's actually a sign of exceptional emotional stability and problem-solving ability, not unpredictability or aggression." As Marcus compiled this growing body of evidence, Eleanor was working her own network of contacts throughout the Virginia horse community. Her decades of involvement with local horse shows, rescue organizations, and breeding associations had created relationships that proved invaluable in building support for Thunder's case. Within 24 hours, she had secured written statements from trainers, veterinarians, and fellow horse owners who could attest to Thunder's character and capabilities based on their memories of him as Storm. The most significant breakthrough came when Eleanor contacted her old friend Margaret Sullivan, a retired Richmond police officer who had worked with the mounted unit during the early years of her career. Margaret had maintained connections within the department even after her retirement, and she was deeply troubled by what Eleanor told her about Thunder's situation. "Something about this doesn't smell right, Ellie," Margaret said during their phone conversation Thursday evening. "Bill Morrison has a history of throwing the mounted unit under the bus whenever he needs to show cost savings or deflect criticism. I've heard rumors for years that he's been looking for excuses to shut down the program entirely and reallocate those resources to areas that would make him look more innovative to the city council." Margaret's insider perspective added a crucial political dimension to their understanding of Thunder's predicament. It wasn't just about one horse's alleged misconduct. It was part of a larger pattern of bureaucratic maneuvering that used animal welfare as a bargaining chip in budget negotiations and career advancement strategies. More disturbing still, Margaret revealed that Morrison had a track record of altering incident reports to support predetermined conclusions. 3 years earlier, he had blamed a mounted unit horse for injuries sustained during a festival crowd control operation, despite witness accounts that contradicted his version of events. That horse had also been quietly removed from service, though in that case, no one had stepped forward to challenge the decision. "The problem is that Morrison controls the narrative because he controls the paperwork," Margaret explained. "Unless someone can prove that his reports are false, he can pretty much write whatever story serves his purposes. But if you can gather enough independent evidence to contradict his official version, you might be able to force an internal investigation." This revelation energized both Eleanor and Marcus, who realized they were dealing with something much larger than a simple misunderstanding about one incident. They were confronting a pattern of corruption and cover-ups that had been enabled by the public's general lack of awareness about police animal welfare policies. Most people simply trusted that officials were making decisions based on legitimate safety concerns, never suspecting that those decisions might be motivated by politics and personal ambition. Marcus decided to take their evidence to his supervising professor at VCU, Dr. Rachel Martinez, who specialized in investigative journalism and had extensive contacts within Virginia's media landscape. Dr. Martinez was immediately intrigued by the story's combination of animal welfare issues, police accountability, and bureaucratic corruption, recognizing its potential to resonate with multiple audiences while highlighting important questions about institutional transparency. This has all the elements of a compelling public interest story, Dr. Martinez told Marcus during their meeting. Friday morning. But you need to be prepared for pushback from the police department and city officials who won't appreciate having their procedures questioned. You'll need airtight documentation and multiple independent sources for every claim you make. Under Dr. Martinez's guidance, Marcus began organizing their evidence into a comprehensive case that could withstand scrutiny from both legal and journalistic perspectives. The witness testimonies, expert opinions, and photographic evidence were meticulously documented, with contact information for sources who were willing to go on the record with their accounts of what had really happened at Monroe Park. Meanwhile, Eleanor was discovering that Thunder's story had already begun to spread throughout social media, despite their efforts to maintain discretion while gathering evidence. Someone had photographed her emotional reunion with Thunder at the animal facility, and the image had been shared hundreds of times across Facebook and Twitter. The caption accompanying the photo described an elderly woman fighting to save a police horse from an unjust sentence, and the response from animal lovers throughout Central Virginia was immediate and passionate. By Friday evening, Eleanor's phone was ringing constantly with calls from strangers offering support, local news outlets requesting interviews, and animal rights organizations proposing various forms of assistance. The story was taking on a life of its own, creating exactly the kind of public pressure that Margaret Sullivan had suggested might be necessary to force official reconsideration of Thunder's case. But Eleanor's growing hope was tempered by an unsettling phone call from Dr. Hendricks late Friday night. The veterinarian's voice carried a tension that immediately put Eleanor on alert, and her words confirmed the worst fears about Morrison's willingness to manipulate the system to achieve his desired outcome. Mrs. Patterson, I received an unusual call this afternoon from Captain Morrison's office requesting that we accelerate our timeline for the horse's evaluation. They're claiming that keeping him here longer than necessary represents an unnecessary expense and want us to conclude our assessment by Monday morning. I wanted to give you advance warning that our window of opportunity is closing faster than I initially indicated. Saturday morning dawned with the kind of crisp October air that normally filled Eleanor Patterson with contentment as she tended to her small garden, but today brought only anxiety as she realized they had less than 48 hours to prevent Thunder's fate from being sealed by bureaucratic expediency. Captain Morrison's attempt to accelerate the timeline had backfired in ways he couldn't have anticipated, galvanizing Eleanor and Marcus into a level of coordinated action that surprised even them. Marcus had spent the night at his grandmother's farmhouse, working with Dr. Martinez via video conference to prepare a comprehensive media strategy that would maximize their impact in the limited time remaining. By sunrise, he had uploaded a professionally edited video to YouTube that combined the emotional footage of Eleanor's reunion with Thunder with expert testimony from Dr. Rodriguez and compelling witness accounts from the Monroe Park incident. The video, titled Thunder's Truth, A Hero Horse Faces Injustice, was carefully crafted to appeal to multiple audiences simultaneously. Horse lovers were drawn to the touching reunion between Eleanor and the animal she had raised from birth. Parents connected with the story of Thunder's protection of little Sarah Chen. Civil rights advocates saw parallels to broader issues of institutional accountability and the silencing of inconvenient truths. Within 6 hours of its posting, the video had been viewed over 50,000 times and shared across dozens of Facebook groups, Twitter feeds, and equestrian forums. The comment section filled with messages of outrage, support, and pledges of assistance from people throughout Virginia and beyond. Local news outlets began calling Marcus's phone, requesting interviews and additional footage for their weekend broadcasts. Eleanor, meanwhile, was experiencing the overwhelming power of social media mobilization for the first time in her life. Her small farmhouse had become an unofficial headquarters for what was rapidly evolving into a full-scale campaign to save Thunder and expose the corruption that had led to his predicament. Neighbors she barely knew were arriving with food. Volunteers were offering to make phone calls and distribute flyers, and journalists from 3 different news organizations had requested permission to film on her property. The most significant development came Saturday afternoon when Congresswoman Maria Santos's office called to express her interest in Thunder's case. As a member of the House Subcommittee on Government Operations and a longtime advocate for animal welfare legislation, Congresswoman Santos recognized the broader implications of what Eleanor and Marcus had uncovered. Her staff was particularly concerned about the pattern of incident report manipulation that Margaret Sullivan had described, seeing it as a potential violation of public trust that warranted federal attention. "Mrs. Patterson," said Jennifer Gim, the Congresswoman's chief of staff, during their phone conversation, "we've been following the developments in your case with great interest. Congresswoman Santos would like to request an immediate review of the Richmond Police Department's animal welfare protocols and incident reporting procedures. We're also prepared to send a letter to city officials expressing federal concern about this situation." This political intervention added a new dimension to their campaign, transforming it from a local animal welfare issue into a matter of government accountability that could have implications far beyond Thunder's individual case. Eleanor felt simultaneously grateful and overwhelmed by the rapidly expanding scope of their fight, recognizing that they had unleashed forces that would be difficult to control but impossible to ignore. Captain Morrison, meanwhile, was discovering that his attempt to quietly dispose of an inconvenient problem had instead created a public relations nightmare that threatened to expose practices he had successfully concealed for years. His phone calls to Dr. Hendricks were becoming increasingly frequent and hostile, with demands that she ignore the media circus and proceed with the scheduled evaluation according to his revised timeline. "I don't care what kind of pressure you're getting from animal rights activists," Morrison told Dr. Hendricks during a heated conversation Saturday evening that she later described to Eleanor. "This horse is a public safety risk, and every day we delay action is another day that taxpayers are paying for unnecessary expenses. I want this matter resolved by Monday morning, and I don't want to hear any more excuses about procedural requirements." Dr. Hendricks, however, was no longer operating in the isolated environment that Morrison had counted on to facilitate his cover-up. The media attention surrounding Thunder's case had brought scrutiny from her professional colleagues, animal welfare organizations, and state veterinary oversight bodies. Any decision she made would now be examined by multiple authorities, making it impossible for her to simply comply with Morrison's demands without thorough documentation and justification. The veterinarian's growing resistance to Morrison's pressure was strengthened by her own observations of Thunder's behavior during his confinement. Far from showing signs of instability or aggression, the horse had demonstrated remarkable composure and intelligence throughout his evaluation. He responded appropriately to commands, showed no fear or hostility toward staff members, and displayed the kind of calm temperament that contradicted every aspect of Morrison's official reports. This animal shows no behavioral indicators that would justify the extreme measures being proposed, Dr. Hendricks confided to Eleanor during a discreet phone call Saturday night. I've examined thousands of horses throughout my career, and I can say with professional certainty that Thunder represents no danger to public safety. Any recommendation I make will reflect that assessment, regardless of pressure from other parties. Sunday. Morning brought an unexpected twist that would ultimately prove decisive in Thunder's case. Margaret Sullivan had been working through her network of retired police officers and current department insiders, gradually building a coalition of people who were troubled by Morrison's pattern of cover-ups and willing to speak out despite potential professional consequences. The breakthrough came when Officer Sarah Kim, a current member of the mounted unit who had worked directly with Thunder for 3 years, agreed to provide testimony that directly contradicted Morrison's characterization of the horse's behavior and capabilities. Officer Kim had been present at Munro Park during the incident and had witnessed Thunder's protective response to the lost child, but her initial report had been altered by Morrison before being submitted to city officials. I wrote in my original report that Thunder's action was appropriate and possibly prevented a serious accident, Officer Kim told Marcus during a recorded interview conducted in her attorney's office. Captain Morrison called me into his office the next day and told me that my assessment was incorrect and that I needed to revise my statement to align with his findings. When I questioned his version of events, he made it clear that my career prospects would be affected if I didn't cooperate. Officer Kim's willingness to go on record with this account of Morrison's pressure and document manipulation provided the smoking gun that Eleanor and Marcus needed to prove their case. Her testimony, combined with the witness accounts from civilians at Munro Park and the expert assessments of Thunder's behavior, created an overwhelming body of evidence that Morrison's official reports were fraudulent. The story reached its emotional peak Sunday evening when WIC-TV aired a comprehensive investigative report that Marcus had helped produce under Dr. Martinez's supervision. The broadcast combined all the elements of their evidence into a compelling narrative that began with Eleanor's tearful reunion with Thunder and concluded with Officer Kim's bombshell testimony about Morrison's attempt to suppress the truth. The public response was immediate and decisive. Within an hour of the broadcast, the Richmond Police Department's phone lines were overwhelmed with calls demanding Thunder's immediate release and Morrison's suspension. City council members who had previously been unaware of the situation issued statements calling for a full investigation of the department's animal welfare practices. Animal rights organizations from across the country pledged financial and legal support for Thunder's defense. Most significantly, Mayor Patricia Wilson announced during a hastily arranged press conference that she was personally ordering a halt to all proceedings involving Thunder, pending a comprehensive review of his case by an independent panel of experts. The panel would include veterinary behaviorists, animal welfare specialists, and retired law enforcement officials with no connection to the Richmond Police Department. The citizens of Richmond deserve to know that their police department operates with integrity and transparency, Mayor Wilson declared. The allegations that have been brought to our attention are serious enough to warrant immediate investigation, and no actions will be taken regarding this animal until we have a complete and accurate understanding of what actually occurred. Eleanor watched the mayor's press conference from her living room, surrounded by Marcus, Margaret Sullivan, and several neighbors who had become deeply invested in Thunder's fate. As the mayor's words sank in, Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and vindication that brought tears to her eyes. Storm was safe, at least temporarily, and the truth about his heroic actions was finally being recognized by the people in power. But even in this moment of triumph, Eleanor understood that their fight was far from over. Morrison still held his position within the department, and the institutional forces that had enabled his corruption remained intact. Thunder's individual case had been won, but the larger battle for accountability and reform was just beginning. The story that had started with an elderly woman's desperate attempt to save a beloved animal had evolved into something much more significant, a test of whether truth and justice could prevail against bureaucratic corruption and institutional indifference. As Sunday night settled over central Virginia, Eleanor Patterson prepared for what she sensed would be the final phase of their remarkable journey, knowing that the next few days would determine not only Thunder's ultimate fate, but also the legacy of courage and determination that had brought them this far. 3 weeks later, Eleanor Patterson stood at the fence line of her expanded property in Hanover County, watching Thunder graze peacefully in the morning sunshine alongside Belle, a retired police mayor who had become his constant companion since his arrival at what was now officially known as the Thunder Haven Sanctuary. The transformation in both the horse and the woman had been remarkable, though in ways that neither could have imagined when their journey began with a desperate phone call from Marcus. The independent investigation ordered by Mayor Wilson had concluded with findings that exceeded even Eleanor's most optimistic expectations. The panel of experts, led by Dr. Amanda Foster from Virginia Tech's Equine Behavior Program, had conducted a comprehensive review of Thunder's case that revealed not only the falsification of incident reports, but also a pattern of misconduct by Captain Morrison that extended back nearly 5 years. The investigation had uncovered evidence that Morrison had systematically altered reports involving the mounted unit whenever the truth conflicted with his predetermined conclusions about the program's effectiveness or cost efficiency. Thunder was the 4th horse to be removed from service based on fabricated charges of behavioral problems, though the previous cases had not attracted public attention due to the absence of advocates willing to challenge official narratives. Officer Sarah Kim's courage in coming forward had inspired 3 other officers to report similar experiences, with Morrison's pressure to alter their statements and assessments. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of systematic corruption that had been enabled by the public's general trust in police authority and the lack of independent oversight for internal departmental decisions. Morrison's downfall had been swift and complete. Within a week of the investigation's preliminary findings, he had been suspended without pay, pending criminal charges related to falsification of official documents and abuse of authority. The FBI had joined the investigation after Congresswoman Santos's office provided evidence of potential federal civil rights violations related to Morrison's suppression of officers who had attempted to report truthfully on incidents under their observation. The revelation of Morrison's misconduct had prompted a broader examination of the Richmond Police Department's administrative practices, leading to the implementation of new oversight mechanisms and transparency requirements that would make similar cover-ups much more difficult in the future. Mayor Wilson had appointed a Citizens Oversight Committee with independent authority to review cases involving police animals, ensuring that decisions would be based on professional veterinary assessments rather than bureaucratic convenience. For Thunder himself, the vindication had come with opportunities that seemed almost too good to be true. The Virginia State Police had offered him a position with their mounted unit, recognizing that his protective instincts and exceptional intelligence made him ideally suited for community policing and public safety education programs. Several private equestrian facilities had extended invitations for him to serve as a therapy horse, working with children and trauma survivors who could benefit from his remarkable empathy and gentle nature. But Eleanor had different plans for Storm, plans that honored both his past service and his future potential while acknowledging the unique bond that had brought them back together. With the financial support of donors from across the country who had been moved by his story, she had been able to purchase adjacent properties and expand her small farm into a comprehensive sanctuary for retired police and military horses. Thunder Haven Sanctuary had become the first facility of its kind in Virginia, providing not only comfortable retirement for veteran animals, but also specialized programs that utilized their training and experience for community benefit. Thunder served as the facility's ambassador, working with school groups and community organizations to demonstrate the intelligence and capabilities of horses while educating the public about the important role these animals played in law enforcement and public safety. The sanctuary's programs had attracted attention from veterinary schools, law enforcement agencies, and animal therapy organizations throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. Dr. Rodriguez, the veterinarian who had provided expert testimony about Thunder's behavior, had joined the facility's advisory board and was conducting research on the emotional intelligence of working horses using Thunder as a primary subject of study. Marcus Patterson had completed his journalism degree with honors, using the Thunder investigation as his senior project and earning recognition from the Virginia Press Association for outstanding student journalism. His documentation of the case had become a template for other young reporters investigating institutional corruption and cover-ups, and he had been accepted into graduate school at Columbia University's journalism program with a full scholarship, funded by media organizations impressed with his work. More importantly for Eleanor, Marcus had discovered a passion for investigative reporting that connected him to his family's tradition of fighting for justice and accountability. He visited the sanctuary every weekend, helping with educational programs while continuing to follow up on leads related to other cases of animal mistreatment within law enforcement agencies across Virginia. The relationship between Eleanor and Dr. Hendricks had evolved into a close friendship based on their shared commitment to animal welfare and professional integrity. Dr. Hendricks had become the sanctuary's chief veterinary consultant, providing medical care for the retired horses, while also serving as an advocate for improved standards throughout the state's animal control system. The most surprising development had been the support Eleanor received from members of the Richmond Police Department's mounted unit, who had been grateful for the exposure of Morrison's misconduct and the subsequent improvements in their working conditions and professional autonomy. Officer Kim had become a regular volunteer at the sanctuary, helping to train younger horses and sharing her expertise with the educational programs. The story of Thunder's rescue and vindication had resonated far beyond Central Virginia, inspiring similar investigations of police animal welfare practices in other states and contributing to legislative efforts to establish independent oversight of law enforcement animal programs. The case had been featured in national media outlets, academic journals focused on police accountability, and animal welfare publications throughout North America. Eleanor's own transformation had been perhaps the most profound of all. At 73, she had discovered reserves of energy, courage, and leadership ability that she hadn't known she possessed. The quiet widow, who had once struggled to save her modest farm, had become a recognized advocate for animal rights and government transparency, invited to speak at conferences and consulted by journalists investigating similar cases of institutional corruption. The Thunderhaven Sanctuary had received visitors from as far away as California and Maine, people who wanted to meet the horse, whose story had captured national attention, and the woman whose determination had exposed a system of corruption that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Eleanor welcomed these visitors with grace and humility, always emphasizing that Thunder's vindication had been achieved through the efforts of many people working together rather than any individual heroism. On this particular morning, as Eleanor watched Thunder and Belle moving through the pasture with the contented rhythm of animals who had found peace after years of service and stress, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them all to this point. The phone call that had changed everything seemed like it had happened years ago rather than weeks, though the intensity of those desperate days remained vivid in her memory. Thunder noticed her presence at the fence and approached with the same gentle curiosity that had characterized his personality since his earliest days as Storm. Eleanor reached through the rails to stroke his neck, feeling the familiar warmth and strength that had made their bond so special from the beginning. His eyes held the intelligence and awareness that had made him such an exceptional police horse, but there was also a new quality of contentment that spoke to his satisfaction with his current life. "You saved a little girl, Storm," Eleanor whispered. To him, using the name she had always preferred despite his official designation. "And in doing so, you saved yourself and helped make things better for all the other horses who will come after you. That's a pretty remarkable legacy for any creature, don't you think?" Thunder responded with a soft nicker and the characteristic head tilt that had always indicated his attention to important communications. Eleanor smiled, knowing that while he might not understand the broader implications of what they had accomplished together, he was certainly aware that his life had taken a turn toward security and happiness that honored both his service and his nature. The sound of Marcus's car coming up the gravel driveway interrupted her peaceful reflection, and Eleanor turned to see her grandson arriving for his weekly visit, his car loaded with supplies donated by supporters from around the region. These regular deliveries had become a symbol of the ongoing community support for Thunderhaven Sanctuary, demonstrating that their story continued to inspire people long after the initial crisis had been resolved. As Marcus unloaded bags of feed and veterinary supplies, Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond the successful resolution of Thunder's case. They had proved that determined individuals could challenge institutional corruption and prevail through truth, courage, and the support of people who believed in justice. The sanctuary would continue their work, providing care for retired service animals while educating the public about the importance of accountability and transparency in all aspects of government operation. Thunder's story had become a symbol of hope and resilience, demonstrating that even the most vulnerable members of society could find protection through the courage of advocates willing to fight for what was right. Eleanor Patterson, the woman who had started this journey with nothing more than faded photographs and desperate love, had discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by those with power and authority, but by ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice when they encounter it. As the sun climbed higher over the Virginia countryside, casting long shadows across the pastures of Thunderhaven Sanctuary, Eleanor knew that this was exactly where she and Storm belonged, together in a place where past service was honored, present needs were met, and future possibilities remained as limitless as the rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon. Dear friends, we hope Thunder and Eleanor's incredible journey has moved your hearts as much as it has ours. Their story reminds us that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful voice for justice belongs to someone who simply refuses to give up on what's right. If this tale of determination, love, and triumph has touched you, We invite you to join our community by subscribing to our channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Every like helps us reach more people with stories that celebrate the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals and the extraordinary things that happen when ordinary people decide to take a stand. We have many more inspiring tales waiting to be shared, each one a testament to the power of hope and the importance of never surrendering in the face of injustice. Thank you for being part of Thunder's journey, and we look forward to continuing this adventure with all of you in our future stories.